Welcome back to my mini-series called Pandemic Reflections. Hi, I am Eliziam and welcome to my channel. And I've got another amazing guest to bring in for you today. This is Peter. He is a man that I work with and he's a good friend. So Peter, hello, welcome to the channel.
Eliziam, I'm going to call you Eliziam. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to our relative virtual fireside chat. We've got our coffee and we've got our tea, so we're well set.
What are you drinking? I've got a herbal here.
Actually, I've got water.
Brilliant. We can work with that. The reason I asked you to come and have a chat about your experience of the last couple of years, because let's face it, we are pretty much on the 2-year anniversary now of when everything started to go a little bit pear-shaped. So the reason I asked you is because I think that your insight in terms of business, finance, economics, I think that's going to be interesting, but also perhaps it has affected the way that you live or work in general, because I haven't known you that long, maybe a year maximum. So how about I shut up and get out of the way and just let you talk? Anything that you would like to share in terms of your professional or personal reflections over the last couple of years?
I think that's a pretty wide brief and topic, because 2 years, in one hand, it's gone quickly. In the other, it's been a little bit like an eternity. And if you think back, it's almost like pre and post. There is a life before and there is a life after, and there was an existence, and I'll use that word, during, because you had 3 different mindsets and 3 different approaches. So pre-pandemic, I think myself, family, colleagues, work colleagues, and even general population, we were existing, living and enjoying a whole series of everyday activities that we got very used to, and by and large it was a positive experience. Then you have a shock to the system, big unknown, the pandemic, and I think the word that was front and foremost in everybody's mind was uncertainty. We were just not used to this in any shape or form, and what did it really mean? And coming from a background like many people did, of planning and thinking and looking ahead, made it very difficult that your time frame and your perspective was completely changed. So both from a business perspective and from a personal perspective, had to adapt literally overnight to a completely different, unexpected and unknown set of circumstances. So from a business perspective, I was running a professional services organization out of an office in Bath. Had a team there, and professional services in many instances were delivered face to face. They were not necessarily a basic, they were a little bit more of a luxury item, i.e. discretionary spend, so liable to be more impacted. So at the beginning of the pandemic, quite happily sitting, working, commuting to and from work every day, in an office in Bath. So we had to stop what we were doing and completely change. We had to equip people with offices at home and move from a face-to-face to a virtual existence. And that was probably for 6 months. Then it became clear furlough was the way to go forward. End result was that actually the office closed. The company was sold. It was actually liquidated, and I moved companies and organizations and jobs and roles probably 6 months into the pandemic. The company kept going for about another 6 or 9 months, but the marketplace had changed so rapidly. And what worked well in one dimension was not fit for purpose in another. And it was that ability to switch, pivot, adapt to changing circumstances that was probably not part of any company or any business's contingency plan. You looked at a contingency plan, it probably didn't have a pandemic, it probably didn't have furlough, it probably didn't have all of those things in it from a risk perspective. So people had to very, very quickly and rapidly change tack. And I think it was a two-tier pandemic from a business perspective. By that, I mean that certain sectors benefited, or not benefited because that's the wrong word, but they were boosted. They had increased attractiveness, logistics or retail, online shopping, all those types of services that could be delivered primarily remotely, that people needed to exist, were on one lane of the motorway, and a whole raft of other businesses were in the slow lane,
in a traffic
or in the hard shoulder, because the demand had dried up. People were not looking and able to do that from a hotel, from a travel, from a high street shop. All of those things rapidly changed. So uncertainty for a long period of time. And I don't think at the beginning of the pandemic, we really appreciated that we'd be looking at 18 months, 2 years.
No, do you remember? We were kind of told it'll just be a couple of weeks. It'll just be a couple of weeks of like not going to work and everything will be upside down, but it'll be fine. And it just went on and on and on, didn't it?
Yeah. Because it's an unknown. You were dealing with an unknown. And that created anxieties the longer it went on. And what did you, from a business perspective, look to do? How did you repivot? So a lot of organizations actually reinvented themselves. They took a time out. What we did before was fit for purpose in that reality. The new reality, I need to have different offers, products, services, and solutions that are reflective of the new marketplace, whatever that new norm will be. And I think that new norm is still being defined. It doesn't exist yet because people are, and businesses and economies and markets are still coming to terms with the position. So the words that I've come to use more and more from a business perspective is that all businesses used to have a budget, a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan. My definition these days of a long-range plan is next month. Next month in cash flow, and next month on what are we going to be doing, and what are the resources that we will require. Much more short term. And the other part of the equation is that pre-pandemic, we were all rapidly moving along the globalization highway. Supply chains, markets, that came to a full stop very, very quickly.
Didn't it?
And today, the focus is on much more local and regional markets. And I don't think that the global highway will be full steam ahead for another 5 years as a minimum. Probably the 2030s, you'll start to see it getting back to where it was, because the pivots and adaptations that people have had to do make it very difficult to go back to the old way or the pre-pandemic way quickly. You've put in place new structures, new systems, new technologies that support a slightly different way of working and thinking.
So I'm trying to imagine myself in your shoes, because you've painted a very, very clear picture actually of how it was at the time when, you're working in Bath. You have this very normal life, which these weren't your words, but I'm kind of paraphrasing here. We took for granted a beautiful state of existence. And then everything did change, almost like somebody had just flicked a switch. And I'm wondering, because you've got two things going on at the same time. And I think as human beings that we're capable of adapting better when there's only one thing changing at a time. So you had your work situation changing, but you also had, well, everything else. We were kind of plunged into a state of fear because of what was happening. Now, again, that's me paraphrasing because that was my perspective. There was this instant moment of shock and danger and, you know, not knowing whether, as Boris Johnson was telling us, all of our relatives were going to die. Maybe not all of them, but some of them were going to die. And it was a scary time. So yeah, how did you cope?
Cope is probably the right word, because it wasn't anything more than coping. You know, in the early days, you were allowed out to exercise for an hour a day. You were basically within the home environment. A lot of the things that you've been used to doing, you couldn't do. So you had to find alternatives. You had to do things in ways that respected the rules, but also respected others. And I think that respectfulness is something that came out, and that came out also in communities. I think communities started to gather momentum. People recognise what was required at a local level and environment. And also it brought into mind, you know, for the first 3 months, I think people did a lot of stock taking. Stock taking personal and professional life balance. And consequential to that, we saw a huge exodus of people from cities into the more rural or environments which offered them space, because people recognized that outdoor space and access to outdoor space, whether that was parks or gardens, but primarily gardens, was critically important to their health and mental well-being, rather than because you weren't socializing or you weren't communicating. Yeah, Zoom calls were a godsend, but there's only so much you can say on a Zoom call, and I think Zoomitis is now a recognised contagion. People have got Zoomitis in many ways, but that, from a personal perspective, for me, miss my family. You know, weren't able to see them, weren't able to engage with them. So that was hard, because you got used to doing things in a certain way. You couldn't help, you couldn't support, you were remote. And all of a sudden, as you said, you were threatened by this pandemic in ways, certainly pre-vaccinations, that made you ultra cautious and careful as to what you did for yourself and what you did relative to friends and families. So that caution, I think, took a little bit of adapting to. It was a necessary restriction and reaction, but it's really hard to not think about it in terms of actually stepping back, stepping into a different type of existence. And you're not quite sure when the doors are going to reopen and when that existence is going to start being reduced or increased as the doors onto the outside world open and closed.
It's interesting that you say about missing your family. I think there were two main camps of people: those who were missing their family and those who were seeing too much of their family. So I don't think that either camp is better than the other. Okay, so let me ask you about where we are now, 2 years on. Do you think it's fair to say it's over or getting there? What's the mood?
The mood music for me is that we've reached a point where we, as individuals and societies, have to learn to live and exist with COVID. If you listen to the healthcare professionals, they talk about the pandemic being 5 years. So if that is the case, we're 2 years into a 5-year pandemic cycle.
Okay.
I can kind of understand that, but everyday life has to resume as best it can and as soon as it can. Yes, there'll be some restrictions, or not necessarily legal requirements, but general behaviours that will be adopted to allow us to live with COVID. Open the door in indoor spaces, wear face masks if that's you feel more comfortable in crowded spaces. I think hybrid working is here to stay. For me, the balance is whether it's 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, or vice versa. But I don't think, unless you are absolutely in the hotel business, for example, or hospitality, where you have to have staff on site, I think that has become the norm. Now, how you then manage and respond and react to that is a completely different set of HR and business dynamics. But that is something that is part and parcel of learning to continually live with the pandemic. From a business perspective, as I said earlier, I think uncertainty still continues. Some of the things that I'm seeing, Eliziam, are that people, businesses, if they are looking to invest, and that investment's $1 million, they're doing it in chunks of 10.
Okay.
Tranches rather than one, because it makes sense. So they are flattening the investment curve, making it slightly longer. And I can understand exactly why, because there are so many variables outside of their control. Normally you have a business plan and 95% of what you are planning to do is within your control. Today, it's a far lower percentage. It's probably 55, 60. But that degree of incremental risk or uncertainty is still being factored into businesses and equations. Inevitably, part of it is that, have I got the resources, human or cash, to be able to undertake that investment? How is that going to be responded to by the markets? If I'm more local and regional and less global in terms of my supply chains and parameters, how does that then fit into what my offer is? What's my pricing? And I think that the cost of living inflationary pressures are not going to die down particularly quickly. So we've gone from the pandemic. We have the dreadful set of events which are happening in Ukraine at the present moment in time. Absolutely abhorrent and awful and dreadful. What other? There's not much else I can say about that. But then you have the energy crisis and prices and costs of living. And they're a reflection as we exit the pandemic that wasn't necessarily on everyone's horizon. I think inflation going up was. Yeah. But I think we're looking at levels of inflation 5 to 8% for the next 2-3 years, which is unheard of for, I would say, 80% of the people that are in business today.
Yeah, of course.
They haven't grown up through, they haven't come through that set of circumstances. So that's another variable that is causing uncertainty and question marks, and people, businesses being a little bit more cautious and careful. The other thing that I've seen in business is that there's been a change of ownership. So the larger organizations or sectoral organizations which have been able to operate during the pandemic have got bigger and stronger. Smaller businesses, because they are most likely to be fleet of foot and innovative, okay, there have been a lot that have not been able to continue in certain sectors, but they, by and large, are continuing. It's the medium-sized companies that have tended to have to consolidate or be acquired. By medium-sized, I'm talking $200 million to $500 million turnover. So that type of organisation has increasingly become an endangered species. because it's neither A or B. And in many instances, those businesses have been the amalgamation of acquisitions, and that natural fit and single focus isn't there.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you about the future, and I know we've had this conversation before, and I think that respectfully we have a different outlook. I think that we're at the beginning of a very serious economic crisis. I think it's going to get worse. I think that the world's economy is going to tumble like a house of cards. I genuinely, I think that that's going to happen. I hope I'm wrong. What do you think is going to happen in terms of economies on a local, national, and international level? I know it's a big question, but come on.
I'm probably, well, I'm not in the doom and gloom and disaster corner that you seem to be. I'm not in the pink elephants and orange balloons and happy camper. Everything is wonderful camp either.
Okay.
But on balance, I am more towards, if you've got 0, which is you, and 10, which is the happy camper brigade, I'm probably 5 or 6.
Okay.
Because I think there is sufficient robustness and resilience within local and regional businesses and economies to be sustainable. I think if we were operating on the global premise and everything was full steam ahead towards the global highway, to quote that highway metaphor yet again, that is a problem. But the last 2 years of the pandemic have caused a considerable rethinking about what is required to be successful. The other overlay, which I think is important, is sustainability. And the old way, pre-pandemic way, was not the most sustainable from energy, carbon, climate change. So I'm optimistic that for the wrong reason, i.e. a pandemic, behavioural changes to be more sustainable, and more sustainable in the majority of cases is more local and regional in terms of miles and all those types of things, will be a catalyst for benefit. I mean, recently the EU said they're going to move away from fossil fuels now by 2027. Carbon neutral plans, more effective and efficient means of air travel. 1, from a climate perspective, that's wonderful. But 2, from an innovation perspective, that's equally important, because it's going to be creating new opportunities and new jobs, new industries, which will help in part pick up some of the legacy economic challenges.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure about currencies or cryptocurrencies, because cryptocurrencies are pretty inefficient from data mining and electricity and energy and all those sorts of components. I think for the next 3 to 5 years, airline travel will be in the doldrums and not necessarily picking up, because we've been used to low-cost travel. Be able to go at the top of the hat at a weekend. I think the cost of fuel, if nothing else, will make airline travel much more expensive, and long haul increasingly unattainable for a lot of people that have previously enjoyed it, sadly.
I agree.
So people changing their consumer habits and their aspirations to be more sustainable, more local, more community orientated is an outcome that I hope, as much as expect, will happen, because it's a reflection of what people will do to continue to enjoy and move forward and progress with their lives and careers.
I absolutely hope you're right, and I love the optimism that you have, and I just want to kind of say that normally I'm very optimistic too. the numbers that we've seen, the money that has been created out of thin air, really, to deal with the pandemic right across the world is just mind-bending. I calculated that it was somewhere kind of, I don't know, 6 months into the pandemic, and the amount of money that we were in debt in order to cope with everything, it would have taken us to have sold a vaccine to every single person in the world for £250. That's the amount of debt that Britain was in. I can't see how we're going to get back to where we were in my lifetime or even in my kids' lifetimes. You know, for me, that's just crazy. It's just crazy. And I know that that is on one level. And even though that might be happening in the background, that life will go on and business will still exist and stuff will still happen, I just get the feeling that it's going to be in a very different way.
My wife and I have fireside conversations about the children and their jobs and their careers, and you know, will we look back and say that as we were growing up and the ability for us to acquire wealth through house ownership and asset ownership was an economic heyday? I think it depends on how you measure it, but without doubt, the aspirations and opportunities in the short to medium term for family and for people entering the job market will be very different, sadly, than what was necessarily previously enjoyed in my judgment. And I think that is just a circumstance of this shift, this paradigm shift. And it is a paradigm shift. It's literally changed everything. Yeah. And, you know, whilst people might believe in them, money trees don't grow in gardens. The only solace really is that the amount of debt that the UK, European Union, America has put on its books is at incredibly low interest rates. So the servicing of that debt at the levels that it was incurred from an interest perspective are historically incredibly low. So that is a small glimmer of light in the economic darkness, I guess. But I'll stick with my 6 out of 10 if you don't mind.
Of course, of course.
Because I think people are adaptive and have got renewed vigor to do things. They recognise it's going to have to be different, but there is an energy that I can sense that people are starting to look and think. People are starting to look for other jobs. They're moving. For 2 years, people didn't move because if they had a job, they stayed. It was now, okay, what else we can do? And part and parcel of that, to be honest, is that it's the only way you're going to get the cost of living and salary increase. So I think the job market in terms of movement will rapidly ramp up. Do we have enough resources? That's a question mark. It depends on what type of industries and sectors 10 years from now are bigger than they are today.
And okay, I know I'm picking your brains a lot, but just before we close, have you got any thoughts on the housing market? Because, yeah, okay, I'd be interested to hear.
Okay, you may or may not know, but I'm fairly passionate about affordable housing. I've served as a non-executive director of 2 or 3 housing associations. So the provision of affordable housing is really important to me. I think the housing market is probably one of the bellwethers for supply and demand. And at the moment, the demand is greater than supply. Certainly within the affordable and certainly within the, I guess, £500,000 and below homes, which is 85% of the market, I would imagine. That's not something that you can change overnight. And even if the government hits its targets of 200 or 300,000 new builds a year, you're looking at a 10 to 20 year program. So the provision of quality, affordable housing is, for me, one of the most important aspects of the next 50 years, because that is the kind of period that you're looking at. I think that with interest rates being where they are, the house is less of an appreciating asset in the way that it was before. It is more an important community and personal asset. It's not an asset, it's a home. It's part and parcel of someone's existence.
Yeah.
And I think the move out of cities and apartment living will accelerate.
I do.
Because the space that comes with that for young families in particular, my heart went out to the pictures I was seeing of the families with young children in flats in London. London as an example of a city that, they didn't get the big picture anymore. And I think that big picture is incredibly important to the mental health and well-being of our children, who are our future.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We're certainly seeing an exodus over where I am to people selling up in far wealthier places than here, which is pushing the cost of buying a house up enormously, because like you say, it's supply and demand, and the rental market around here is an absolute nightmare. I know a couple of families that are really, really worried about not having anywhere to live because they are being chucked out by their landlords. Not necessarily just one is so that they can cash in on the amazing rise in house value. The other is because the landlord can't afford to do the repairs which will put the house at a level where it can legally be rented. So it's a legislation issue that's causing homelessness.
My eldest daughter is surgeon, orthopedic surgeon in the NHS. And she was in Truro, Cornwall, for a year.
Nice.
And the NHS were struggling not to recruit staff per se, although that is always a challenge. It was to find anywhere for them to live. There was nowhere for them to live. The local population was being priced out either by Airbnb or second homes. Staycations had a role to play in that as per the pandemic. But the reality is that the local communities that are necessary, vital to support infrastructure, health services being a good example, have to be able to live and live sensibly close to where the work is. If that gets broken, then there's a really big and increasing disconnect.
Yeah, it's the same around here. Plenty of caravans. But hey, Peter, I could talk to you all day. It's fascinating, and I'm so grateful that you have come onto the channel and shared your experiences, which it's just invaluable. So really, thank you ever so much for your time and for your knowledge.
Thank you for putting up with me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Okay, so getting in touch, you know what to do. All the normal ways are down below, so have a look. And there is just enough time for me to thank you for liking, subscribing, and putting that alert notification on so that you never miss an episode. And if you like this channel, don't tell me, tell your friends. I'll see you next time.